January 17, 1945. The Colmar Pocket, Alsace-Lorraine. The frozen earth rang like iron beneath his boots. Private First Class Alvin Harley crouched in a shell crater on Hill 351, his breath forming ghosts in the bitter morning air. Around him, the skeletal remains of what had once been a French vineyard stretched toward the German lines, black, twisted vines clawing through snow like the fingers of buried men. The sky hung low and gray, pressing down with the weight of 1,000 bomber runs. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thunder rolled across the Vosges foothills, but here, in this moment, there was only the wind and the smell of cordite clinging to everything. He was alone. The rest of his platoon, 3rd Platoon, Baker Company, 254th Infantry Regiment, had pulled back in the chaos of the previous night's assault. Harley had been separated during a mortar barrage that turned the hillside into a constellation of fire and frozen mud. Now, as dawn broke pale and reluctant over the Alsatian plain, he found himself occupying a position that military doctrine said required at least a full squad to defend. He had 3 rifle grenades, 200 rounds for his M1 Garand, a single canteen half frozen against his ribs, and a box of K rations that had survived the night in his coat pocket. The hill commanded a vista of the approach roads the Germans needed to reinforce their crumbling defensive line. Command had wanted this hill. Men had died taking it, and now it was his to hold. In the mythology of American warfare, there are moments that defy strategic analysis, episodes where the texture of history compresses into a single human soul standing against mathematical impossibility. This was to become one of those moments, though Harley, 22 years old, a machinist's son from Duluth, who had never imagined himself as anything more than another anonymous body in the great churning machine of war, could not have known it then. He only knew what the lieutenant had. Screamed before the retreat, hold until relieved. 4 words, a lifetime of meaning. The German army that winter was not the unstoppable juggernaut that had swept across Poland and France in those intoxicating early years. By January 1945, the Wehrmacht was a skeletal echo of its former self, bled white across 2,000 miles of Eastern Front catastrophe, hammered flat beneath the weight of Allied air supremacy, its logistical network strangled by fuel shortages and crumbling infrastructure. Yet it remained dangerous, perhaps more dangerous now in its desperation than it had been in its arrogance. The soldiers facing Harley across that frozen vineyard were not supermen. They were boys and old men pressed into Feldgrau uniforms, fed on black bread and ideology, told that one more sacrifice, one more miracle of will, might yet turn the tide. They had been promised wonder weapons and final victory. What they got instead was frozen ground and American artillery, but they still had orders. And orders, in the German military tradition, were executed with mechanical precision, even when reason had long since fled the field. Harley settled deeper into his crater and checked his rifle again. The Garand, 8 pounds of walnut and steel, fed by an en-bloc clip that pinged when empty and could put a 30-06 round through a man at 500 yards, had become an extension of his nervous system over the past 7 months. He had carried it through the hedgerows of Normandy, through the frozen forests of Lorraine, through towns whose names he couldn't pronounce and probably never would. The weapon was caked with dried mud and gun oil, its stock scarred by impacts he couldn't remember. But it worked. American machinery always worked. That was something the Germans had learned the hard way. The first probe came at 0720 hours, just as the light improved enough to see movement against the snow. 4 soldiers in white winter smocks, advancing by bounds across the vineyard terraces. Below. Harley let them close to 200 yards before he fired. The first shot caught the lead man's center mass, spinning him into the snow. The second jammed, a common issue in the freezing temperatures, but Harley worked the operating rod handle with practiced violence and put down another German before the squad scattered into cover. He shifted position immediately, crawling 20 yards to a fallen log before the answering fire came. Mauser rounds cracked overhead, methodical and searching. The Germans were probing, testing. They didn't know yet that he was alone. This was the advantage of terrain and the American doctrine of marksmanship. The Wehrmacht had always emphasized fire volume and tactical aggression. The U.S. Army, by contrast, had built its infantry around the idea that every soldier was a rifleman first, trained to hit what he aimed at. Harley had qualified expert on the rifle range at Fort Benning. On Hill 351, that training translated into something the Germans would interpret as a well-defended position. One man firing with discipline and accuracy could, for a time, create the illusion of many. But illusions have limits, and the morning was young. The sun, such as it was, climbed higher behind the clouds. Harley rotated through his positions, crater to log to a half-collapsed stone wall that might once have marked a property boundary, firing in controlled bursts, never more than 2 shots from any single location before moving. The Germans came again at 0845, a full squad this time, supported by an MG-42 machine gun that tore the hillside apart with its distinctive buzzsaw scream. Harley went to ground, letting the suppressing fire pass over him, waiting. The German infantry doctrine was predictable: suppress, advance, close. When the machine gun paused to change barrels, the MG-42's only tactical weakness, Harley rose and dropped 3 men in rapid succession. The survivors went to earth. The attack stalled. It was during the lull that followed that Harley ate. Not from hunger, his stomach was a clenched fist of adrenaline and fear, but from the systematic logic of survival his sergeants had drilled into him. Eat when you can. The K-ration box came out of his pocket with fingers he couldn't quite feel. Inside, a tin of ham and eggs, desiccated and rebuilt into something that resembled neither ham nor eggs but would keep a man functioning. 4 crackers, a fruit bar that had the consistency of compressed sawdust, a small packet of instant coffee, 4 cigarettes, chewing gum, toilet paper, and a wooden spoon. The ration, 48 ounces of carefully calibrated nutrition designed to sustain combat effectiveness in the world's best-fed army, represented something the Wehrmacht could no longer match. By January 1945, the average German soldier's daily ration had collapsed to barely 2,000 calories, much of it ersatz bread bulked with sawdust and potato flour. Meat was a distant memory. Fats had disappeared entirely. The men trying to take Hill 351 were advancing on empty bellies and the vapors of ideological fervor, while Harley, even alone and surrounded, had better logistics than an entire German battalion. He ate mechanically, forcing the food down, and thought about nothing but the next moment. The ham tasted like salt and metal. It was, in that moment, the most important thing in the world. The Germans had expected many things when they invaded Poland in 1939, when they rolled through France in 1940, when they stood at the gates of Moscow in 1941. They expected quick victory. They expected the racial superiority their ideology promised would translate into military dominance. They expected the decadent democracies, America, especially that mongrel nation of jazz and materialism, to collapse when confronted with Germanic will and discipline. What they had not expected was this: the sheer, overwhelming industrial and logistical supremacy of a nation that could feed its soldiers ham and eggs from a tin, while simultaneously producing 50,000 aircraft a year. The third assault came at noon. This time the Germans committed serious force, perhaps 30 men advancing in a coordinated rush from multiple angles, covered by mortar fire that walked across the hilltop in thunderous columns of frozen earth and shrapnel. Harley abandoned his forward positions and fell back to the hill's military crest, a natural defensive position where the slope's geometry gave him maximum fields of fire while minimizing his own exposure. He worked the Garand like a pianist at a brutal keyboard, loading clip after clip, the ping of the ejected en bloc becoming a rhythm section to the percussion of rifle fire. Men fell. Others kept coming. The distance closed. At 50 yards, Harley transitioned to rifle grenades, slotting the projectile onto his Garand's muzzle and angling for plunging fire. The first grenade landed among a cluster of advancing soldiers, and the explosion carved a hole in their formation. The second misfired. He'd loaded it wrong in his haste, and he threw it aside, going back to aimed fire. The Germans wavered. Their momentum broke. They fell back, dragging wounded, leaving dead. Harley reloaded with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped the clip. His water was gone. His ammunition was half depleted. The sun stood at its winter zenith, offering light but no warmth. He had been fighting for nearly 5 hours. Time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that defied chronology. Each moment contained eternities. Each eternity collapsed into instants of pure, animalistic survival. He thought about Duluth. He thought about the machine shop where his father had taught him to read micrometers and appreciate the beauty of precision. He thought about a girl named Catherine who had kissed him at the train station and promised to write. He thought about none of these things. His mind was blank and full simultaneously, operating on levels beneath conscious thought, processing angles and distances and the deadly geometry of small unit tactics. In the German positions below, officers were arguing. Harley couldn't know this, couldn't know that the local company commander was facing a dilemma that had become endemic to Wehrmacht operations. They lacked the artillery support to simply obliterate the hill. They lacked the tactical reserves to commit to a proper assault. They lacked, increasingly, the faith that had once made German soldiers the most tactically aggressive in Europe. The ideology that had powered the Reich's early victories, the certainty of racial destiny, the belief in ultimate triumph, had been ground down through 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter. But orders were still orders. The hill had to be taken. The American position had to be eliminated. What the Germans couldn't understand from their perspective in the tree line below, was that there was no American position. There was only Harley and his rifle and the dwindling ammunition and a stubbornness that had less to do with courage than with the simple fact that retreat was no longer an option. He was too far forward to disengage safely. He was surrounded on 3 sides. The only direction left was to hold. So he held. The 4th assault came at 1,430 hours, and it nearly succeeded. The Germans had worked their way through dead ground on the hill's northern slope, using the terrain's folds to close within grenade range before Harley even realized they were there. The first stick grenade, the distinctive German potato masher with its long wooden handle, landed 10 feet away. Harley rolled, and the explosion slapped him with overpressure and frozen dirt. His ears rang. The second grenade was closer. He scrambled away, firing blind, and then they were among his positions, gray figures in the smoke, and everything became point-blank chaos. He shot a man at 15 feet, worked a bolt, shot another at 10. The Garan's ping meant empty. And he had no time to reload, so he reversed the weapon and swung it like a club. 8 pounds of American steel connecting, with a German soldier's jaw with a sound like a dropped melon. The man went down. Harley dove for his dropped rifle, got a clip loaded, spun, and fired at a figure emerging from the smoke. The range was so close he saw the man's eyes, blue, very young, very wide, before the round took him in the chest. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The survivors broke and ran, sliding and stumbling back down the hill. Harley stood in the center of his small kingdom of violence, breathing in great ragged gasps, his hands crimson with blood from the rifle's impact, his entire body vibrating with adrenaline and shock. Around him lay the detritus of close combat, spent casings, German equipment, bodies in feldgrau and winter white. The smell of blood and cordite in voided bowels, the ancient stink of war. He had 2 rifle grenades left, perhaps 80 rounds. His canteen was empty. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, but he was alive, and the hill was still his. The afternoon dragged toward evening with the agonizing slowness of geological time. The Germans probed twice more, half-hearted efforts that Harley repulsed with aimed fire. They were learning respect for Hill 351 now, that much was clear. What had started as a simple mop-up operation against what they assumed was a bypassed American squad had revealed itself to be something more costly. Their dead lay scattered across the vineyard approaches. Harley counted at least 15 bodies, though there were certainly more wounded who had been dragged away. For a Wehrmacht company already below strength, these were losses that couldn't be easily absorbed, but neither could Harley's situation be sustained indefinitely. He was down to his last 40 rounds. The temperature was dropping as the sun declined toward the western hills. He had no food left, no water, no communication with friendly forces. Fatigue was becoming a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders, blurring his vision at the edges. He had been in continuous combat for nearly 10 hours. The human body, even in extremis, has limits. As dusk gathered, he heard engines, German engines, the distinctive clatter of a Panzer's transmission, the deeper rumble of half-tracks. They were bringing up armor. The next assault would be the last, one way or another. Hill 351 had become important enough to merit mechanized support, which meant Harley had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. He had held. He had made this piece of frozen French hillside so expensive in German blood and German time that it had become strategically significant. But against tanks, alone, with 40 rounds, there was no holding. There was only the end. He checked his rifle one last time, loaded his final clip, positioned himself in the deepest part of his crater and waited for the darkness. The sound that saved his life came from behind him, American engines, the deep-throated roar of Shermans, and the higher whine of half-tracks carrying infantry. 3rd Platoon hadn't forgotten him. The company commander, having reorganized his scattered units after the previous night's chaos, had committed his armor to a counterattack aimed at relieving Hill 351 and exploiting whatever German weakness the hill's defenders had created. They expected to find a squad, battered but intact. They expected to find a defensive position. What they found was Harley, alone in his crater, so exhausted he could barely stand, surrounded by the evidence of an impossible day. The relief force swept past him, engaging the German armor in a sharp, brief clash that sent the Wehrmacht forces reeling back toward their main lines. Medics came for Harley, but he refused the stretcher, refused until he had counted his remaining ammunition, checked his rifle one final time, and satisfied himself that the hill was truly secure. Only then did he allow himself to be led down the slope to where the company command post had been hastily established. The captain looked at him for a long moment, this mud-caked scarecrow of a private who had somehow held a critical position for an entire day against multiple assaults. "How many?" the captain asked. "How many were with you?" Harley's voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse from shouting and smoke. "Just me, sir. It was just me." The captain's expression flickered through disbelief, comprehension, and something that might have been awe. He nodded slowly. "You held the hill, Private. The Germans never advanced again. It was true. The defensive Hill 351, whatever its tactical designation, had bought the time necessary for the regiment to consolidate its positions. The Colmar pocket would be reduced over the following weeks. The last German toehold west of the Rhine eliminated, the war would grind on toward its conclusion in the rubble of Berlin. But here, on this frozen hillside in Alsace, the mathematics of attrition had favored the Americans in a way that transcended mere numbers. One man with adequate supplies, adequate training, and adequate weaponry had matched and defeated superior enemy numbers through the advantages that industrial democracy provided. The Germans had expected the Americans to break. They had expected soft, undisciplined soldiers from a soft, undisciplined nation to collapse when pressed by Teutonic will and military tradition. What they encountered instead was the product of a different kind of system, one that fed its soldiers, equipped them with weapons that functioned in freezing temperatures, trained them to think and act independently, and backed them with a logistical apparatus so vast and efficient that even a lone private abandoned on a hillside still had more material support than an entire enemy company. After the war, military historians would analyze the defense of Hill 351 as a case study in defensive tactics and individual initiative. They would diagram Harley's positions, calculate his ammunition expenditure, interview survivors from the German units that had assaulted the hill. The numbers told a story. One American soldier over the course of 10 hours had inflicted approximately 30 to 40 enemy casualties, disrupted a critical German counterattack, and held terrain that doctrine said required at least a squad to defend. The after-action report was spare and factual, the way such documents always are, reducing human experience to map coordinates and casualty figures. But there was another story beneath the statistics, one that the Germans themselves understood in their bitter withdrawal from Hill 351. It was the story of ham and eggs in a tin, of K rations that could sustain a man through a day of continuous combat, of a rifle that fired 8 rounds without reloading and almost never jammed. It was the story of an army that could afford to train every soldier to expert standards because it had the time and resources to do so. It was the story of a nation whose industrial might was so overwhelming that its wealth cascaded down to the individual infantryman crouching in a frozen crater, making him more lethal, more sustainable, more survivable than his opponents could match. The Germans had built an ideology around will and sacrifice. The Americans had built a system around logistics and abundance. On Hill 351, as on 1,000 other hills and beaches and forests across Europe and the Pacific, the latter proved more durable than the former. Harley never sought recognition for what he had done. He accepted the silver star they pinned to his chest at a ceremony he barely remembered, standing at attention in a clean uniform while a colonel read citations that turned the worst day of his life into something called valor. He wrote letters home that mentioned nothing of Hill 351, focusing instead on the weather and the food and how much he missed Duluth. When the war ended and he returned to the machine shop, he found that precision work still made sense to him in ways that human behavior no longer did. The measurements were absolute. The tolerances were fixed. A part either fit or it didn't. There was comfort in that certainty. But sometimes in the years that followed, he would pause in his work and remember the weight of the Garand in his hands, the bitter taste of K-ration ham, the sound of German voices calling to each other across a frozen vineyard. He would remember being 22 years old and terrified and alone, holding a hill because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. He would remember the moment when the relief force arrived and he understood, with a clarity that transcended words, that he had been part of something larger than himself. Not the abstract glory of patriotic rhetoric, but the concrete reality of an industrial democracy at war, grinding its enemies beneath the weight of organized abundance. The recurring symbol of that day, the thing that stayed with him more than the firefights or the fear or even the faces of the men he killed, was that tin of ham and eggs, Such a small thing. Such a mundane thing. 48 ounces of processed meat and nutrition science, wrapped in olive drab packaging and distributed to millions of American soldiers across dozens of theaters of war. But on Hill 351, alone and surrounded, it had represented something profound. The promise that even in extremis, even at the furthest extent of supply lines stretching across an ocean and a continent, the American system would provide. Not luxuriously, not comfortably, but adequately, sufficiently, enough to keep a man fighting when fighting was the only option left. The German soldiers who retreated from that hillside carried their own symbols: empty bellies, failing equipment, the growing awareness that the promises of ultimate victory had been lies wrapped in ideology. They had been told they were supermen fighting subhumans. What they learned instead was that material reality outweighs ideological fantasy, that logistics defeats willpower, that a well-fed soldier with a functioning rifle will beat a starving soldier with superior morale every single time. This was the lesson of Hill 351, though it was a lesson written in a language too stark for comfortable comprehension. Democracy, real democracy as opposed to its rhetorical form, was not about speeches and principles. It was about ham and eggs. It was about the Garand that fired when you needed it to fire. It was about an industrial base so vast that it could afford to equip millions of men with weapons that would have been impossible luxuries in any previous era of warfare. It was about the unglamorous, grinding, absolutely crucial work of feeding and arming and supplying armies across global distances. The Americans had mastered this work, not through ideological purity, but through the messy, inefficient, adaptive mechanisms of democratic capitalism, the same mechanisms that the fascist states had declared decadent and doomed. But decadence, it turned out, had teeth, and abundance, properly organized, was the most devastating weapon of all. In the decades after the war, Hill 351 faded from memory. It was not Normandy or Bastogne, not a battle with a name that echoed through history. It was simply one small piece of ground among thousands, held by one soldier among millions. The vineyard recovered. The shell craters filled with grass and wildflowers. French families returned to their land and rebuilt their lives. The dead were buried and mourned and gradually forgotten. Only the land remembered, in the way that land always remembers. Fragments of shrapnel still working their way to the surface with, each spring thaw, the faint depression where Harley's crater had been. But the truth of what happened there remained true. One man had held against many. Not through superhuman courage, though courage was certainly involved. Not through tactical genius, though his instincts had been sound. He had held because the system that sent him there had given him the tools to hold. He had held because democracy, for all its flaws and failures and compromises, had learned to feed its soldiers and arm them and train them in ways that totalitarian efficiency could never match. He had held because abundance, properly weaponized, defeats scarcity every time. This is the epilogue that matters, the reflection that transforms Hill 351 from tactical footnote to philosophical statement. The American experiment, whatever its sins and shortcomings, had discovered something the old empires and the new fascisms had missed. Power comes not from the purity of blood or the strength of will or the discipline of formations. Power comes from the factory that produces 50,000 rifles a month, from the farm that feeds an army and a nation simultaneously, from the logistical network that delivers ham and eggs to a crater in Alsace. Power comes from the messy democratic process of free people deciding to organize their abundance toward common purpose. Private first class. Alvin Harley never spoke in grand terms about what he had done. He was a machinist who had briefly been a soldier, who had held a hill because the alternative was dying on it, who had survived to return to a life of measurement and precision. But in holding that hill, he had embodied a truth that the 20th century was still learning, that freedom is not merely an ideal but a material condition, that democracy is not just a political system but an economic force, that the factories of Detroit and the farms of Iowa were as much weapons of war as any rifle or tank. The Germans never advanced again past Hill 351, not because they lacked courage or discipline, they had both in abundance. They never advanced because they were fighting an enemy they had fundamentally misunderstood. They saw decadence where there was actually adaptability. They saw materialism where there was actually systematic organization. They saw weakness where there was actually the most formidable force the world had yet produced, an industrial democracy at war, backed by continental resources and animated by the conviction, however imperfectly realized, that every individual, even a lone private in a frozen crater, mattered enough to equip and supply and support. This was the victory of Hill 351, not a victory of arms alone, but a victory of systems. Not a victory of one man over many, but a victory of one way of organizing human society over another. The hill was held, the line was maintained, and when the sun rose on January 18, 1945, over Alsace-Lorraine, it rose on a small piece of earth that had become, for one impossible day, the distilled essence of why free men, adequately supplied and properly trained, could not be defeated by slaves to ideology, no matter how fierce their commitment or how grand their vision of destiny. The ham and eggs were long since eaten. The garand had been turned into supply. The soldier returned to civilian life. But the truth remained. Carved into that frozen hillside as surely as the shell fragments still buried there, abundance is the armor of democracy, and on Hill 351, for 10 hours in January 1945, that armor held against everything tyranny could bring to bear. The Germans never advanced again.